Well, what prompted this video is I mentioned to a lady that the survival movement at one time, or prepper movement, went underground for a while thanks to a tyranny president called Bill Clinton. And she had never heard about that, and a couple other people hadn't heard about it, but in the 90s it happened. This is called How the Survivalist Movement Started by Cats Valley Prepper. I'll put a link to this so you guys can go read this yourself. What unites us is that we actively prepare for emergency. But how did survivalism begin? When and why did the term prepper come about? What's the difference between a prepper and a survivalist? There are many reasons why understanding our own history is of value to us. It's important to know yourself. But to us, perhaps the most relevant is it helps us adapt to future disasters. You've got to learn from the past. When the roots of the modern survivalism movement grew from financial instability in the late 1800s, the Second Boer War, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, 2 world wars followed by the chance of a global thermonuclear war. And they, in turn, rooted in tradition of agriculture, which requires farmers to store food throughout the winter and spring for the next harvest, and also to protect against lean years. But by 1900, people living in the Royal American West were descendants of pioneers, miners, and trappers. It was their grandparents who settled the Great West. Gun ownership, gardening, canning, and hunting were simply their way of life. However, urbanization had people moving into the cities at record numbers, and within a couple generations, camping, hunting, and gardening became recreational activities instead of a way of life. Thank God for the LD, the Latter-day Saint Church, all of which influenced early survivalist movements. In the 60s, this saw the first writers of modern survivalist movement, such as Harry Brown and Don Stephens, and they come forward about nuclear war and civil defense program, developed in response and building fallout shelters and arming yourself and storing food. Okay, well, we will bypass this thing here. In the 70s, a number of survival writers who would influence the modern survivalist movement came onto the scene, such as Bruce Clayton, C.J. Cobb, Jeff Cooper, Carl Hess, Dan Ing, Howard Ruff, Kurt Saxon, Joel Skokin, Mel Tappan, and others. Soldier of Fortune magazine was founded in 1975. And it was not specifically a survivalist magazine, but it did cater to them, and it was one of the few choices they had back then in the 70s. Then you had the International Practical Shooting Confederation by Jeff Cooper. He got started. In the 80s, saw more publications by the same writers of the 70s, with Bruce Clayton publishing Life After Doomsday in the 1980s. You writers like Rhaegar Benson, Lofty Wiseman, and they also published the SAS Survival Guide. I can also remember seeing and reading American Survival Guide magazine around at this time. Beckwith's Home magazine was also published in 1989. Yep. 1990s. Okay. During the 1990s, this is what I was telling this lady. During the 1990s, the Clinton administration launched a massive propaganda campaign that vilified the survivalist movement, attempting to brand this as racist, white supremacist, and domestic terrorist. So, under the direction of the Clinton administration, the FBI and the ATF paid informants to infiltrate survivalist and militia groups, befriend lone survivalists, and attempt to get them to break the law. Several such cases were dismissed as entrapment. Other informants successfully entrapped militia members. They even showed survivalists and paraded them around in handcuffs and showed their preparation on display on their front lawns. Their gun collections were deemed arsenals and owning food storage, waterproof primers, or purchasing Army surplus gear were determined to be sound reasons to report your neighbor to the FBI. The attack on the survivalist movement resulted in the atrocities at Ruby Ridge and Waco and provoked the tragic Oklahoma City bombing. As a result of the Clintons' massive propaganda campaign, the survivalist movement was that militia members were driven underground and that the term survivalist was turned into a bad word. In the aftermath, although dedicated survivalists still prepared, most ceased to advertise that fact. Most militias disbanded or broke down to independent rifle cells. They were largely driven underground, building to a leaderless resistance. By the year 2000, nobody wanted to be called a survivalist, but after 9/11, they started coming out of the woodwork. They needed to call themselves something else to distance them from being called a survivalist. Because these nitwits in office had the world believing that all survivalists were racist, child molesting, domestic terrorists, and labeled prepper, it became usage. So now the survivalists are now identified as preppers. Midway through this decade, survival TV shows and survival blogs came about. And the survival preparedness index began a growth phase. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a market that could barely support a magazine or two had been more than one TV show and growing fast. And Survival Man by Les Stroud also appeared on the air in 2005. Thanks to the new TV shows, kept growing every couple months, the survival expositions grew. They had these volunteerism reached levels not seen since the height of the Cold War. Disasters kept happening, and the disasters of the previous decade were too recent to forget. So, with the survival gone mainstream, it became cool to be survivalists for a while. Many of the new folks had lived through the 90s, and some who were forgotten, so militias once again began to operate openly, sometimes even brazenly. The 2013 revelation that resulted from the Snowden leak did little to dissuade them to operate underground as a leadership resistance, so many learned painfully in the 1990s. Then Hollywood come around. Doomsday Preppers. The model of the program that was each prepper was preparing for some singular threat to the inclusions of all others, more ridiculous than the better. Preppers who appeared on the show reported that production staff bribed them to say things that they were really unwilling to say because they were untrue and cast them into an unfavorable light. In the end, people saw past their motives, and the show eventually changed strategy. So the sheeple, being who they are, poor coverage of emergencies and election of President Trump's combined to the devastating effect to both the survivalist movement and to the survival preparedness market. Politically oriented websites that received users covering the threat posed by President Obama and Hillary Clinton saw up to the 80% reduction in traffic. Personally, I fail to see what the government has to do with this. Okay, anyway. We can't predict the future in our world is steadily growing more complicated and therefore more fragile. By looking to our roots and understanding our past to the end, we're becoming more self-reliant. We can become more resilient and even more anti-fragile, meaning that we can grow stronger in some ways in response to the volatility and changes we face instead of letting it damage us. Our ancestors stored food and carried weapons and the tools they needed to make shelter and fire for good reasons. They knew where their food came from and how to get more. I think most folks today could use a little more of that these days. After all, our food doesn't really come from the grocery store. This is the guy's, I'll zoom this in. That's the guy that wrote the article. I'll put a link to this. Go check it out. Like I said, during the 90s with Bill Clinton, the survival movement, the prepper movement, they went underground. And just like today, you're always worried about the government coming to steal your hoard of food that you paid for and you stored up, or that you canned, or after your ammunition, or after your firearm. That's why people are underground, and that's why people aren't opening up. It's called lack of trust. Like I said, people. During the 90s, the Clinton administration launched a massive propaganda campaign that vilified the survival movement, attempting to brand us as racists, white supremacists, and domestic terrorists. Under the direction of the Clinton administration, yep. So now you guys know. Oops, excuse me. Let me get this back up here. I will put a link to this. It's a doggone good article. Like I said, I wouldn't even look for it, but I didn't want to try and go through all my paperwork to find that thing that was back in the 90s about Bill Clinton and how he hated survivalists. I mean, he hated them. He wanted to have lists on them so he knew where they're at, where they were located. And the thing is, that's none of their damn business. We have the right to be left alone. And you shake up at tranquility, and you get all kind of shit coming back at you. Unintended consequences. So that's how it all started. And like I said, lack of trust. Do not trust your neighbor. I mean, you can't trust anybody anymore because when it comes right down to it, somebody will snitch on you for one reason or another. You'll always guard your butt. Thanks for watching, guys. I should thank that woman for making me do this video. She didn't ask me to do it. Yep, prepping by faith. Thanks, lady.